our understanding was quite different. We felt that part of the process of taking control over your life collectively required accessing resources that were necessary for you to maintain that life. So that involved the politics very often of the situation of either convincing or forcing the state to relinquish its monopoly on resources. So people were active in many kind of issues and campaigns, one of which was around people with disabilities. If I remember rightly, the particular link between what the cooperative was doing in a wide sense of trying to build community organising efforts was that Dermot and Anne-Marie Flanagan were local people, and they were rooted in a local culture which I think probably had a very strong view on self-sustaining endeavour. That was probably the background to the idea of working within the co-ops, using the co-op space as an office, working through the co-op's contacts and building links with other organisations. It was quite difficult, I know, for the DPOC at the beginning because the state was very slow to recognise their existence once they were linked in to that kind of, I think the problems were rural space, being located in a rural area, being located out of a village, actually in the countryside 2 or 3 miles from the nearest settlement of any size. And the state's view was, by and large, they weren't serious about their business because they didn't locate themselves in the centre of the service industry, which would be the town of Ennis.
The initial seeds were sown through the co-op here in Roxton. The co-op itself had been looking at unemployment and travellers issues and refugees issues and marginalisation. Hold on a minute, what about the disabled community or people with disabilities? And suddenly realising there was 350,000 people or thereabout in Ireland, 12% of the population of Ireland, having disabilities.
So I suppose myself and Dermot and a few others recognised the need to respond to our needs as equal members of society, and that's why we and the others set up the Disabled People of Clare. There's a wide range of age and experience here, and I think that's what made the DPOC the success it is, because
I just like the camaraderie of the whole thing. I think it's very important. It's very important that we're not used as medical models, and that's what I really liked about. That's what I really like about the DPOC, that we're human beings.
I remember one of the first campaigns that was ever undertaken by the DPOC was that, I suppose, when the NRP were trying to close the office.
yeah, he mentioned that.
And
92.
Tony was very, very vocal.
Dermot started talking to different people like Donica and Declan and of course yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And then Thomas came along and Jerome and all the rest of them. And it was primarily to get equal rights for people with disabilities because they were being trodden on over there. And, you know, everybody, regardless of what disability we have, should have the equal rights to be able to go out and get a job if they want a job. Because you stand together and you fight harder for what you think is right.
The service providers themselves were managed and controlled and dictated by professional managers. We were very hurt by this, that the voluntary organisations locally were all managed by able-bodied professional people.
Because how can an able-bodied person know what a disabled person wants?
Our strength, first of all, is that we understand what we want. We're clearer on it than any other group, any people out there. So that's the strength of people with disabilities. It has our own knowledge, our own expertise on disability.
I grew up in a small village in north of Clare, and I have two brothers and I'm in the middle. And I grew up in a small community that was really supportive, and I really didn't recognise that there was much difference between me and all the other children on the street. My experience at National School was absolutely fantastic. The first time I really recognised that there were huge differences and noticed societal attitudes when I went to secondary school, and unfortunately those 5 years were very traumatic, disempowering, and it really reinforced the lack of expectations that society had on people with disabilities.
I have been reflected deeply on my own situation even as a young lad when I was growing up, and my mother would say it to me, and while I would love my mother and great respect for my mother, but she was always constantly reminding me that I was the weaker one in her own way, weaker member of the family, that my brothers and sisters would look after me when I got older. And I remember then later on in life when having girlfriends and obviously much later then getting married, family saying to me like, God, you really don't need to get married, really, you know, we could mind you and look after you type of thing, really, you know. And I found that really driving me on to make me this type of guy I am, is driving me on, and the passion. There's so much work to be done on the margins and people on the margins.
In previous years, a lot of people generally would have spoken at me rather than to me. And there's a very subtle difference between somebody talking at you rather than to you. And I would have been very much brushed aside and so on. But things are improving, I think, for disabled people, but only very, very gradually, unfortunately.
Some of the churches were almost inaccessible. You have to sit almost above the altar in front of everyone else. I didn't mind, but I found it a bit of pressure on me that I had to go up there, up to the very, very front seat, even in front of the front seat. I was there almost answering mass for the priest, rather than being going to mass or whatever. So, it wasn't very inviting.
So I always wanted to move and come into my own space. So I applied to the Auburn District Council for the house, and I was applying for ages. And you know, it was about 3 years I was applying. So then I went to my mother one day and I said, I've got a house, Mum. And she said, well, I never go inside your door. That was her first reaction to it. But now I can't give her out. Everyone looked for their own house. They applied for everything. Look for the house, because it's the best thing I ever did.
And at the age of 13 or 14, arriving in a situation where I had to deal a lot with the health boards and the doctors and the medical people. It's like going to doctors and doctors talking down to you and talking over me as well, really, when they were talking about myself and my own disability.
This young psychologist was there and I was dismissed. You can go and do your shopping, Mrs. Rents, says he to me. And I kind of threw him a look. But I left Donegal there with him anyway, and I came back an hour later. And this young guy said to me, after being with Donegal for 1 hour, he turned to me and says, well now, Mum, I think you're going to have to send him to a special school because he's dull. I was absolutely appalled. I said, how dare you insult my son like that? I've lived with him for 7 years. I know him inside out and upside down, and he is the life and soul of our home. He is not dull. How dare you? And we never went back. We never went back to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And I just think that, you know, I mean, there are parents out there who do bring their children and who do believe what the experts say. And I think that if a mother or a father has a doubt about what an expert is saying about their child, to challenge it. And don't be afraid to challenge it. Because what do they know?
was brutally taken away from my family at the age of 4. Well, it was very, very hard being away from home because I was effectively a stranger, and I'd only come home about 4 times a year. So I felt really, really excluded from my family because of my disability and the fact that I had to move away from home. They were sighted and I was visually impaired, and as far as I know, they wouldn't have come across anybody with a disability before me. So they didn't. They just got on with their own lives and left me to get on with mine. I spent the time in a bedroom playing records and pretending to myself that I was a disc jockey on a fantasy radio station. I went into my own little world and let reality just go by. It affected me very badly. I was mostly within an institutionalised setting and there was all rules. And while that seemed to be good for me at the time, in the fact that I had no responsibility, it stunted my growth, it stunted my mind and my ability to question things and to work things out for myself. Well, I've overcome that through being in my own house since 1998, and with the support of the DPOC and with the support of organisations like GROW. It was very, very tough, me having to decide what I wanted as opposed to another person deciding what I wanted. But gradually I'm getting there and getting to know how to decide what I want and to know how to articulate it. It gives me more freedom, and I'm being treated now more ordinarily. I still face exclusion today. I was on to the European Commission to try to get the mobility allowance for blind people, and they refused to help me to do it.
Wheelchairs and with white sticks, some people they go round and live among the tiger cubs in lovely Ennistown. Our faces may be different, but we all have human needs. We ask you not to judge us, but to look upon our deeds.
We've never looked at who it is we're talking about. We've never looked at the emotional experiences. We never look at what it is the state and the organs of the state does to people. This is an abuse of power. What happens for disabled people and happens to other groups who are discriminated is a violation of people's human rights.
At a government level, at a national level, in the Constitution, changes have to be made in our Constitution of Ireland, Bunrock na Héireann, which is our Constitution. And those changes have to be made from the very perspective of people with disabilities, really.
The government really should put in place some form of policing the building regulations and that to make sure that they are accessible. There's still a great deal of places that are not accessible, simply because there is nobody there to police the laws. The laws are there, but it's not being really enforced.
Well, the DPOC, along with CIL nationally, needs to look at that constitutional provision where it says the state shall cherish all our children equally and give them equal rights before the law.
There have been a lot of developments in law and Irish disability law. Personally, a lot of us remember the Employment Equality Act 1998, and that was significant. The Equal Status Act 2000, that was significant. These are pieces of legislation that demand equality for disabled people in Ireland, and as such are very important. There have been some less positive developments. Despite a Commission report in 1996 calling for the introduction of a Disabilities Act, we don't even have a Disabilities Bill.
Communities talked about regularly in Ireland for the last 6 or 7 years. Community this, community that, community radio, community groups, community employment programs, county development boards where they have communities. And understanding what community is and where community is at I mean, included in that should be people with disabilities.
We talk about community involvement. Well, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that I can go to the shop? Does it mean that I can go to the post office? What it really means, the same as anybody else, is that within the community that I am seen as somebody who can make a contribution.
It was almost unique in the mid to late 80s to find community organising efforts whose vision was independence. Because in a way, most of those efforts were coming from marginalised people. And while every generation throws up a certain amount of marginalisation, there is always this other process of people fighting their way in from the margin into the centre, and very often not being able to identify which route to take when they now become part of, I suppose, mainstream society. And during the 90s, the DPOC was under a lot of pressure to become mainstream. And the people who were trying to maintain a vision of independence were trying to find a way in which that could be based on an economic independence. And obviously in industrial society that means having a job. And most of the state's interest was in skilling people to avail of jobs, not in terms of how they could live an independent life and what kind of structures and practical activities were needed for that.
Our vision was basically rights issues, right? Our entitlements, our rights. That independent living would be our philosophy, because by where we stood in our lives, we were advocating independent living as a way of living for people with disabilities, having rights and choice.
In Scandinavian countries, America, places like that, and that's where we learned about the independent living movement.
The whole idea of independent living has been awakened, if you like. And the whole idea of having independence and having your own personal assistant, and you know, these are things that are very, if you like, important to people with disabilities.
So it's one of the most important developments in Ireland is the whole independent living movement, and we're still at a stage where we're at the hands of the Department of Health and Finance. If the economy is going well, then they can pump some funding into personal assistance. Well, what I'm saying is I want legislation in the country to ensure that my personal assistant needs are enshrined in legislation, that it is my right to have it. So irrespective of what's going on, that I know that we'll always have a sufficient support to be able to get on with our lives.
The main thing about getting involved with the DPOC was personal assistance. We need more funding for personal assistance at the moment.
We really haven't received the great benefits from the Celtic Tiger, so-called, because we seem to have been overlooked year after year when they were handing out various money.
There's one single bus, public bus in Ennis that's accessible, low-floor bus in Ennis and County Clare. People are still going in the goods car, in the train to Dublin.
I've done it.
So that's the aspect of the people out there in rural areas maybe who are not looking for things or demanding things because they don't know what's available.
My opinion of the DPOC is that it is actually brilliant, right? But it does need to, it needs to tackle rural disabled people. I can feel very lonely here at times, to be honest.
I agree with you.
Well, with communications and technology developments now, there is really no reason why a person should be isolated.
And the move to Ennis was quite a psychological move for a number of people on the basis that you were moving into a very urbanised area. You were moving into an area where you had to have, effectively you had to have the door open that many hours of the day, and there were going to be a lot of more people coming into your office, a lot of more expectations there. When we moved into Ennis, not that we were on our own essentially, but we had lost that solidarity that we had built up in Roxton in the previous number of years. Found our members being country people, which really needs to be noted, that we were all country origin, the green fields and the wild bushes and the streams and the mountainsides, etc. We were all the founder members were born in that type of an area, and moving into an urban area was really a big change.
This is looking at it from the outside. They came under a lot of pressure as an organisation to perform in a manner which was not helpful to building their own organisation. They had, for example, to spend a lot of time on administration, on planning programme delivery, on ensuring programme implementation, on identifying follow-up sources of funding and so on.
We are now providing a service which was probably not our intention the first day, but the funding has more or less guided us along that line.
But when you see so much paperwork that the health board piles up in front of you and the forces pile up in front of you, and you say to yourself, what is it all about? Because really we don't have the same involvement of people with disabilities, the leaders we call them now, in the day-to-day decisions. Which
every group and every organisation needs money to run that. But I think we can get too caught up in the paperwork as well.
Oh, you know that.
I mean, myself and Jerome and every one of us here, we were all involved in different arts different arts groups.
Service provision that the DPOC are partaking is completely consuming our energies and our resources. Every time we come together, we're not talking about what's our next issue, how do we challenge this, it's how are the staff going, have we enough money to pay the bills. We need to be resourced.
We need skills.
Skills. Because the services that we have to be implicit in the rights model. So we all have to, one has to be interact with the other. Why should we get into service provision if that's not what we are? That's the hardcore question. We have to be asking ourselves, did we go too far too fast? And have we the guts to say, maybe we're not the people who should be offering day services, maybe we should be monitoring day services.
I mean, there's no point in being involved in an organisation that's a service provider.
No.
We founded it for ourselves with a vision, and we need to get back to that.
We have come a long way.
Oh, we have,
but we haven't come far enough.
No.
Because, I mean, with the thriving of the economy in the past 10 years, I mean, we only got pennies. We only got pennies.
Now we're at the stage 10 years down the road where we are providing a service for people with disabilities, and maybe our lobbying and campaigning has kind of gone back a bit. So we need to look at the whole structure again. After 10 years, there's no harm to have a re-evaluation anyway. I think we need to find somewhere where we can do both, provide services and also get back in the lobbying campaigning.
Hugely successful, and I mean, like the pride, the change in people's lives, the belief in people, you know, and so forth. It's amazing, really, and nobody could have predicted this 6-7 years ago when DPOC first got going, you know. But I think we have to, and they have to as well, look at now that there's another decade, right, and that we haven't reached the destination yet. The fact that we've gone a good bit of the way, I mean, like, I don't think, what's his name, Gerlach Nana would be allowing any team to rest at half time. I think the second half could be a different game, you know. So that's the way I see it, you know. But like, that's never to take away from what, you know, what's been achieved already, you know.
Attitude towards disabled people is very much informed by a capitalist notion of productivity, you know, and your capacity to produce and consume. That's an awful lot of what informs the analysis of disabled people. And we, as a culture, would have, somewhere within our culture, within our psyche, there is a conscience. But it is incredibly clouded and become incredibly clouded by what this capitalist produce, consume idea.
You know, you go into the real world in a sense too, when you go into a factory and they'll make allowances up to a point, but then they expect, you know, production is the requirement at the end of the day, and they expect, you know,
to get that much out of their employees, regardless of whether they're disabled or not.
People with disabilities to date have been looked at around our productivity level. So when we look at productivity level, we look at employment in a very mechanical way. So we look at, okay, what do we think people with disabilities can do? So before the individual has developed and identified who they are and what they want to do, it's decided that people can become secretaries. Computers is a big one, sitting on lines in factories. Or if they're sitting down, whatever is safe. So already we're saying to a disabled person, don't have any expectations of yourself. There are people who are misplaced. There are people with disabilities who are in training centres who will be there for the rest of their lives. There will be people who are in sheltered employment and sheltered workshops. We haven't questioned enough how can people be part of the mainstream and develop who they are. We don't look at people laterally. We look at people in black and white and productivity.
By and large, there's something like 75% unemployment among people with disabilities.
Poverty is a big issue among people with disabilities. There seems to be an attitude problem really between employers and people with disabilities. They seem reluctant to give us a chance and to even let us in, to prove our worth in the workplace.
Not being able to gain employment, I suppose, forced me to go back and to focus on the reasons why I didn't get employment, and I suppose there's where I have to say the disability didn't help. It was an upsetting time, but meeting the lads, meeting the group, and I suppose learning to campaign and to lobby and to lobby as a group, I suppose that was a great experience.
Going around town and going around looking for different jobs, and obviously being politely refused in some cases because they're looking at you and they know that you have a mobility difficulty. You couldn't do that kind of a job, could you? You wouldn't be able for it,
I see so many jobs. They're all everybody people. And I know in my heart and soul that there is plenty of people, ordinary people with disabilities that could easily do that job.
It's a big industry.
It's not big, it is.
Yeah, it's an industry.
It's an industry, exactly, for able-bodied people.
You weren't expected by the state to ever work again once you were on an invalidity pension, and the invalidity pension by its name puts you in a particular bracket that the state had decided, well, you are not going to work again. We're going to put you there effectively on the scrap heap. We're going to give you some supports, very minimal supports, but effectively. And I looked around, there were people that were on invalidity pensions and disability allowances and living right on the margins of society.
I think that disabled people are always sort of put on the back burner. I keep hearing and hearing about this quota of people that each company is supposed to be giving jobs to for disabled people, and I've never met anybody that's in this quota. I don't know whether it's a figment of most people's imagination or whether it's something they keep telling you and it's not coming to fruition or what, but I really don't know many people that are in any quota for people being employed as disabled people in a normal workforce.
There are still some closed doors, even in employment particularly. They don't see the person. They don't recognise the person. All they see is the wheelchair or the crutch or the splint or whatever. The disability is out in front. And naturally, they get overlooked.
There isn't enough kind of places for disabled to get into employment. There's always kind of, this job you can't go for because maybe the access is not there or whatever. Just facilities aren't there. So if they can change that, make more laws into it, that companies or factories, whatever, would buck up their ideas and accept that they're going to have people with disabilities looking for jobs there.
We're coming up against fear, that how we cope.
coming up with unwillingness to put in access, a lack of understanding of how important it is to accept everybody, that the workforce will be strengthened by the inclusion of a mix of people with disabilities, able-bodied, people from different backgrounds. That's the aspirations of the local employment service are great, but there isn't enough extra support. In other words, there isn't support for me to go and spend time with employers explaining to them the benefits of the schemes that are there to get them to support people with disabilities within the workforce.
But there's so many out there, I know I meet myself practically every day, that are quite anxious to get into the workforce, quite anxious to fulfill themselves, and have the dignity of having some sort of a recognition of a wage packet on a Friday or a Thursday when they come home, and to be able to get on with their normal life instead of having to depend on this £84 social welfare payment a week.
We want to be treated equally, and we have rights, same as anybody else, and it would be a nice thing to see that our rights were looked after. You know, we're entitled to live, we're entitled to work, and if there is a means by which we can do that, I think it behoves society in general to see to it that those aids and supports are put in place.
On behalf of SIPTU, the National Executive Council, and indeed the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, the whole issue of disability is very high on our agenda. We need to get more people with disabilities in membership, and being in membership of the trade union will mean that it will make our voice stronger at national level.
Myself, what has driven me on to be involved in this organisation is knowing that when you're on a particular income and you have a disability, that there's a lot of activity, a lot of society is shut down to you being involved in it. Even things like being on the vocational education training opportunity scheme back in '91, when I was asking to get onto that, you weren't allowed onto that in '91 because for the virtue of the fact that you had a disability allowance. That particular course was only for unemployed persons. And I remember that's really how, I suppose, the questions began to pop up in my head, really, that, right, why can't we be involved in that? Why can't we have this opportunity to be re-educated?
One of the big factors in my consciousness raising has been the arrival of the organisation, the Disabled People of Clare. And they would have, I think, affected my thinking a lot, and the thinking indeed of the Adult Education Service generally, in terms of now beginning to look at buildings in terms of universal accessibility, really. It's not just enough to put a disabled toilet in a corner of a building and say you are disabled friendly. I think we've come to realise that there is more to it than that. A lot of achievement there, and certainly a lot of influence in the state sector, and certainly a lot of influence in the adult education sector.
Mm-hmm. So the DPOC had its own vision of independence, and the way in which it could access resources was very much determined by the state's agenda.
There was a degree of apprehension insofar as dealing with people having disabilities was something new to me. And then when I saw 3 people approaching the office and coming in, and one in a wheelchair, there was a degree of discomfort, and they were basically asking what service could FÁS provide to assist them. And after discussing, having a lengthy discussion, Dermot Hayes, Martin Naughton and Marie Flanagan, we felt that a community employment scheme might be the way forward to provide some assistance. So essentially we're talking about personal assistance for people, to give them and to improve their quality of life.
A lot of schools were almost inaccessible. I felt degraded about it because I had to meet the teacher outside rather than meet him inside. And I couldn't get in because there was maybe 2 or 3 steps into where the meeting was. And they'd meet me in the car one by one. And I think it affected the children as well.
Negative attitude that I experienced was lack of education and access to education, because when I was a child, the schools were inaccessible. And then later on in life, access to employment was very difficult.
When I was in kind of secondary and I suppose primary, they weren't made for wheelchairs. I suppose when they were designed, they never really thought someone in a wheelchair would be going there.
And they don't seem to realise that the benefits that people with disabilities can bring to society by being involved in society at different levels, in the national school, in the secondary school, in the third level school, in the jobs area.
And despite pressures from all sorts of places, we even right through to his schooling, we wanted him to be involved in a regular school, and the powers that be wanted him to go to a special school. But I think my sort of gut reaction to that was that if Donnacha went to a special school, he would lose his spirit. I will never forget one day I came into him and he had been very unwell, and he said, "I shall feck it now," he said, "the sky is blue and the sun is shining, I'll be grand." And he literally lives from day to day, and it is the one great thing we have all learned. We don't project into the future, we just live from day to day, and long may it last.
And in everything we do, in everything we're associated with, we can bring these issues forward. If it comes to, just buildings onto schools, being part of parents groups in schools, being part of sports organisations, being just citizens of a town.
So we have to start at the beginning, and the beginning starts with the children. And if people had been educated properly about people with disabilities right from the word go, it wouldn't be so bad.
The reality of the movement, the disabled people's movement in Ireland, is that it is made up of adults with predominantly physical and now sensory disabilities. So there's a huge sector, there's a huge section of the movement that's on a day-to-day basis excluded. People with learning difficulties, people with mental health difficulties, but absolutely seriously excluded to date within the movement and the rights-based approach are children. So when we talk about a baby or a child with a disability, what happens? We start talking about doctors, nurses, specialists, coping, benefits. Okay, they're a reality, I accept that, but we don't do it in the context of that child being a human being with equal rights.
We need our youth. We need to see that they're able to stand up and fight for their rights now.
To any young disabled person, whether they're in a wheelchair or whatever disability they have, if they have a goal, set their goal and keep to that.
Well, I think if people want to make choices for their children, and if they have the feeling that, but that's not my right, or I'm not able to do that, or just do it, I can only say to you, please do it. Make noise, go out and shout about your child and make demands, because it's your entitlement.
Don't talk about attitudes. We talk about physical manifestations of access like formats and ramps, but we don't talk about attitudes. And every single disabled person, no matter what their impairment is or their condition is disabled fundamentally by attitudes. And those attitudes affect our access to every single part of Irish life.
If you asked any member of society what are the barriers to people with disabilities, they'll talk about services, employment, education. But we don't talk about issues around our emotions, who we are as people, and our sexuality. We kind of shy away from it. People with disabilities, we've been asexual up until recently. If we look at the horrible experiences of a lot of people with disabilities in institutions, girls were sterilised. They were sterilised because if sexual abuse happened, at least they wouldn't get pregnant. That's how we dealt with people with disabilities in Irish society, and I'm not sure that has changed all that much.
I think attitudes affect things that Irish people find it difficult to talk about, like sex and sexuality. I think it's about providing spaces to talk about things like that, to talk about how people's attitudes affect the most personal and intimate parts of our lives.
When I engage with people with disabilities, people will, in a supportive environment, say, yeah, I want that relationship. Yeah, I'd like to have a child. And that's something that I miss out on. If I talk to older people, they have a lot of pain around that, because their experience, their life, and the situation they found themselves in didn't facilitate them to fall in love or to maintain a love they might have had, and to have children, because society says that disabled people are dependent people who need caring, and how could we care for anybody else?
I think there are more disabled women out there saying, no, I don't have access to motherhood. I know I'm not treated like other women in my society. I am excluded from the other things that other women take for granted.
We also need to look at supporting people who are homosexual, and the fact that they might feel already oppressed by their experience of being disabled in society. We also need to support them around their sexuality, and how does that fit into our agenda. So we don't have any black and white responses to it, but we just need to have a conscious awareness around the diversity of people's life experience and around sexuality.
My love, my love, my love, I am waiting for you.
It is abuse of people's humanity, and it's invisible and it's accepted, which is other abuses of humanity that take place get discussed, and there's a dialogue around them. But if they're taking place in institutions, and those institutions can sometimes be families, if they're taking place in all sorts of behind closed walls in communities right around rural Ireland, there are these buildings where people are nobody knows what the hell is going on inside it, and nobody ever stops to question, is it right that people are going and living in these places?
Where does violence happen? At the moment, we see that when Women's Aid talks about violence against women in general, they talk about domestic violence, and domestic is in your home with your partner. But disabled women can find themselves in institutions. Their home may be not made up of one partner who's violent against them. It could be, where is their domestic sphere? It could be a residential care environment. Do you know, it's about broadening out what we believe is domestic.
Years been by and now the child is 20. Though his dreams have lost some grandeur coming through, there'll be new dreams, maybe better dreams and plenty before the last revolving year is through, and the seasons they go round and round, and the painted ponies go up and down. We're captive on a carousel of time. We can't return, we can only look behind from where we came, and go round and round and round in the circle game, and go round and round and round in the circle game.
I'd like the DPOC to be taken seriously, you know, as an organisation, and to be funded properly, you know, with proper support workers and advocates.
I think they're sufficiently committed to solidarity amongst people who are marginalised, that it is seen by the state as extremely challenging. It offers a new politics. It offers a new way in which society could be organised, in which autonomy could have local expression.
Communication between the likes of the disabled people of Clare and the Refugee Council, the Travellers Group, etc. You know, maybe we should open up communication lines there, and maybe there's experience we can share among each other.
The disabled people unfortunately know all about the lack of integration of services and social responses to their lives. The culturally diverse communities that are coming to Ireland hopefully won't have to know that kind of exclusion that the disabled people of Clare have known for so many years, and that we will all move forward into a more integrated social world where old, young and people of different abilities will mix well and hopefully have a more community-based life.
Networking is very important for the travellers, the refugees and the disability people of Venice, so they can come together and try and help one another with discrimination.
The DPOC have a long history of providing services and supports for people with disabilities, particularly their whole area of campaigning for the rights, particularly the social rights of people with disabilities in this county. The DPOC were there before, they were at the cold face of it within the county, and we consulted the DPOC at the very start, and we were very happy to network with them. Now they've had a huge impact on a lot of things within this county, particularly access and rights and entitlements around transport and the whole area of inclusiveness, which is very important, that people with disabilities should not be left out. Mainstreaming is very, very important.
Hopefully, I see a future where we don't have to go to court, where we don't have to go to the Equality Authority or the Director of Equality Investigations. That's my utopia. My vision of the future is where we have, at the very least, a decent legislative background where disabled people can say, these are our rights, enforce them.
The way forward is a recognition that at the government level and at policy level that these issues need to be addressed, and then to actually translate them down into practice on the ground. And I suppose another example would be that there has been a commission report on a whole range of issues in relation to disability, and it's actually putting that report into action.
My vision for the future is probably the same as it was, we'd say 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago when we kind of started out on this road, and that is that where people with disabilities, all people with disabilities, would have, either through themselves or through type of agents, brokers, that they would have absolute control of their own lives.
I would see the next kind of decade that we're in has been much more human-centred, it's much more people-centred.
Well, the DPOC is unique in that it was one of the first organisations that identified a group of people who in themselves are unique because they have suffered social rejection, stigmatization, and in some instances a criminalization. They have been denied access to participate in the society where they lived. They have often been removed from that society and institutionalized, and they have been left without a voice. In terms of the work of the DPOC, they have managed to recover that voice, and they have supported and facilitated many people in giving expression to that voice. Now that is their work. It's extremely difficult work to do without resources, but to become totally focused on accessing resources will undermine that challenge.
There wouldn't be any service for people like me without the DPOC.
I think we are in the vanguard of making sure that the Health Board listen to us as people with disabilities.
It was one of the main reasons that the group was formed, that people with disabilities would, I suppose, be in charge and be in charge of their own destiny.
We have no chance of winning unless we challenge the system. We have to fight the system, and I think that's gone back 10 years, we said that.
We're in a new century, and we're all still pretty vocal, and we have learned a lot, and we've made a lot of things happen, we've made mistakes, but I think really looking at ourselves, look at the organisation, that has changes been made, and I think we're able to make the changes.
Yeah.
We're able to make them, which is the good thing. We're not afraid of change, and we need to stand up and say, hold on a minute, let's make the changes that are necessary concerning people with disability. Get back to people with disabilities being in charge, like Declan said.
And if we can challenge the system and the state, we can challenge each other. I want the future to embrace our children, and that includes our children with disabilities, to expect of all children the best for them, and to ensure that they develop that all children develop in a way that's right for them in the context of their family, in their community. I suppose the biggest dream of all is societal attitude, that changes. And it's amazing, right? It doesn't cost money. It doesn't need legislation. It doesn't need an organisation. But it is the hardest thing to change. So I suppose if you were to ask me, the one thing that I want to change is to have a society, an Irish society, that really accepts us for who we are, and that it's okay to be different.
That the whole question of the disability movement and where it's going, there's no doubt about it, but we have to unite at some level. People with disabilities, not the organisations or the professionals as such, but people with disabilities have to come together and realise politically it's in our interest to come together.
Mutual support. Our motto at the very first day was nothing about us without us.
Nothing about us without us, yeah.
Fair, and I will always love you, my lovely Rose of Clare. Oh, my lovely Rose of Clare, you're the sweetest girl I know. You're the queen of all the roses, like the pretty flowers that grow. You are the sunshine of my life, so you